Buenas, hello everyone. Welcome to the last CMO, the finale of the CMO Climate Equity LA series. My name is Andres Gonzalez. I use he, him pronouns. I'm program manager for environmental justice at the Liberty Hill Foundation. And it's my pleasure to be with you all today. Buenos días a todos. Mi nombre es Andrés González. Uso los pronombres él. Soy miembro de la organización, la Fundación Liberty Hill. Como un recuerdo, as a reminder, if you need interpretation services, so please pick that little globe at the bottom. Buenas a todos. Si necesitan interpretación para esta noche, si por favor pueden hundir el globito hacia abajo y eligen el canal en español para poder acceder sus necesidades para traducción. Gracias. Hoy tenemos dos intérpretes, Fabián y Alejandra. Son geniales y nos ayudarán hoy con la interpretación. Thank you. And yes, and feel free if you have any tech issues or anything to just message us in the chat. Si tiene cualquier necesidad, si por favor nos puede mandar un mensaje en el chat y ahí los ayudaremos. So next slide, please. Cool. Just to start us off, you know, this is the last climate equity series event. I really appreciate everyone who's been able to attend. As a kind of, you know, wrap up of everything that's come before, we're just really curious to hear what is one thing that you've taken away from this series, que es una cosa que usted se llevará de esta serie después de todos los talleres que hemos tenido. And I'm going to share the voting link in the chat just to kind of get us started for today. 1 second. Here we go. Yeah, what thing stood out to you? What thing really something you'd like to kind of that really stood out in any of the workshops, something that you may have learned, maybe something that you already knew before that you kind of saw in a different light. You know, anything that may have come up throughout the series. We're just really curious to know what stood out to you and something that we might even kind of reincorporate back into the, Epa! I love that. Whoever put hope. Oof, así mismo, just like that. Really appreciate that. And also, if you feel more comfortable just writing in the chat too, you know, what esperanza, así mismo. Cross collaboration, I see Maria Patino, thank you. Swimming pools need to be definitely more accessible, especially in summer heat waves, particularly for low-income families. Connecting with folks, I'm seeing in the chat as well the need for community connections, not being alone no matter what the issue, right? I think highlighting the intersectionality of a lot of these struggles, really appreciate that. Collaboration. Cool, we'll give it a little bit as this kind of folks trickling. Welcome everybody. Just to start us off, we're just asking folks, what is one thing that kind of stood out to you from this series? I'm seeing common concerns across communities, similar impacts occurring all across the city and the county and the region really. Education, communities being the experts. Amen, that their needs need to be prioritized and their knowledge being prioritized. Yeah, appreciate it. We'll give it one more minute. And then just to highlight, para los que están apenas llegando, si necesitan necesidades de traducción, que si por favor pueden hundir el globito que está para abajo en la pantalla y eligen el canal de español. For folks arriving, if you can just kind of pick the little globe at the bottom and just pick the Spanish language translation, that would be super helpful. And I see it's at 6:05. But you know, just to kind of, as we're starting off this last workshop, any takeaways that stood out to you would really be interested in hearing, things that we can even maybe bring back into, you know, future series and future events moving forward. So I'm just gonna copy the link again in the chat for folks just arriving, or also feel free to go to menti.com. And I'm seeing some notes in the chat too. Getting city planners to really listen to the community. I think the need to really center again on community priorities. Let's see. Issues we have discussed, maybe discussions among candidates running for office, or ways that we're kind of seeing that in the recent mayoral district races, as well as all the races going on at a lot of different levels in the city. And then co-designing community-led policy is difficult, but definitely necessary work. I'm thankful for this phase. I appreciate that. Whoever put that, thank you. We try, but we're working bit by bit. And cool. With that, I think I will then pass it to Marta Segura, Director of CIMO. Marta, if you want to start us off.
Great. Good evening, and thank you for joining the Climate Equity LA series and our finale on Justice40 and climate equity metrics. I'm Marta Segura, the founding director of the Climate Emergency Mobilization Office at the City of Los Angeles. So today we're going to focus on how we can align Justice40 with our state and city initiatives to ensure that the 40% of federal infrastructure funds are invested in the communities that have been historically disinvested and most impacted by climate change. Because the truth is, no city has done that with metrics and has not been able to operationalize it to that extent. So in doing this alignment and executing this alignment, we aren't only addressing climate equity because it's the morally right thing to do. We're doing this because we need these equity guardrails and metrics to create climate policy and equitable investments to transform our economy so that we don't further harm the climate and we heal the planet. We just can't achieve climate goals with an extractive economy that supports false solutions. It's thus our responsibility to develop a regenerative model that works to achieve social and ecological well-being for all. There are deep intersections amongst climate, biodiversity, equity, health, jobs, housing, and just economics. We can't have a healthy community without trees and biodiversity. And we know that the urban heat islands have been caused by overdevelopment and not respecting the need for nature. Jobs and housing are seemingly also go hand in hand. We need to work near where we live, and we must pay a just and living wage so that we can all thrive. The Biden-Harris Justice Initiative, 40 Justice Initiative, is now closer to being a reality in California. Assemblymember Bryan has introduced the state legislation to invest no less than 40% of our billions in infrastructure funds to disinvested and disadvantaged communities. The bill would require the state to spend at least 40% of those funds on projects that provide direct benefits to these historically neglected communities, with an additional 10% earmarked for projects to help low-income households. This would go a long way in achieving our climate goals. Our challenge then is to operationalize and create accountable metrics for climate equity, such as equity accounting, equitable contracts administration, and planning for this work to come to fruition. It's not just the allocation of the funds or the setting of the policy, it's having the resources to implement and then to track the spending. And I also want to reiterate that climate equity is a human right and a civil rights issue, and that these historical disinvestments in redline communities have also concentrated polluters and extractive industries in these very same areas, causing and further harm such as asthma, cancer, autoimmune diseases, birth defects, just to name a few, which in turn shortens lives and limits the ability to reach the full potential of these community members. These are known as sacrifice zones or fence line communities, and they are located in areas of Los Angeles, such as Wilmington, Pacoima, Boyle Heights, Watts, many parts of South Los Angeles, just as a few examples of these areas that need our attention. The model we are creating is derived from resident identified needs, giving community members much more ownership over policies such as mapping climate resilience hubs and EV charging stations and microgrids in low income and disadvantaged communities. We want to see the electrification of new low income and middle income homes, identify financing for retrofits of older and existing buildings for electrical appliance and for climate adaptation. So we want to make sure that our blueprint at CIMO, the Climate Emergency Mobilization Office, brings a whole of government approach to the city of Los Angeles. And that's why we have invited today to speak to you both Capri Maddox from the Civil and Human Rights and Equity Department, as well as Dr. Davis, our Commissioner for the Board of Public Works, in addition to obviously Assembly Member Bryan, who has brought forth the Justice40 bill at the state level. So now it is my pleasure to introduce to you Commissioner Dr. Davis, former State Assembly member and currently President pro tempore for the Board of Public Works at the City of LA, who will moderate our first roundtable. Dr.
Thank you.
Davis.
Thank you so very much, Marta, and it is an honor and privilege for me to participate on this very significant and critically important climate emergency mobilization conference. We have talked about the panelists, but I just want to once again commend them. Marta, as you know, is the founding climate mobilization director for the city of Los Angeles. And of course, our founding general manager of a newly developed department by Mayor Eric Garcetti as well. The Department of Civil and Human Rights is the dynamic Capri Maddox Esquire. And finally, Isaac Bryan, as you know, one of the youngest state assemblymen in the state of California, who happens to serve as majority whip and chair of the elections committee. And with that, I'd like to start our conversation off with some inquiry from our Assemblyman, Isaac Bryan. Assemblyman Bryan, can you tell us about the bill, California Justice40 Act?
Absolutely, and the Honorable Mike Davis, it's always great to be with you. And of course, my sisters at Capri Maddox, thank you for all the work that you do and all of the organizers of the panels today. It's incredibly important work and I'm grateful to join. When President Joe Biden signed the historic infrastructure bill, he called for 40% of those funds to go to disadvantaged communities. He did it by executive order. And the governor of California, Governor Gavin Newsom, said that's a great idea. And he signed a letter in support. But then we didn't codify it as a state. There was no executive order. There was no legislation. There was no framework for how to do this. And it left a lot of local communities figuring out, how do we access these resources? How do we make sure they get to where they need to go? And so what I have proposed in AB 2419, with the help of a lot of community partners, a statewide coalition, is an accountability task force to make sure that these funds go where they need to go. It's a group, a commission that would make recommendations to the state about where this money should go. And to be clear, California is set to get $44 billion of these funds. And we can have, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Finish your thought.
We can have a lot of discussions about historic disinvestment and neglect, but what we're talking about with this is new money, right? This is new pie that we need to cut up in a way that's equitable and goes to those communities who have historically missed out on infrastructure investments. And so that's why we have built out this task force. We've operationalized disadvantaged at the onset to be mindful of the California environmental screen, which is one of the better tools to look at environmental neglect. It measures air quality and a bunch of other historic indicators of communities that have been impacted by environmental injustice. I represent the Inglewood oil field, which is the largest urban oil field in the country. But as we make it through the process, we're continuing to refine disadvantage so we don't leave anybody out, which is part of the reason why we went for low income as well, an additional 10% carve out, because we know that there are some just poor communities that have clean air.
What communities would be eligible for funding, and how would they qualify as disadvantaged?
Yeah, so again, we would use the California environmental screen, which has operationalized by zip code and by community, by county, by city, where disadvantaged is based on environmental hazards, proximity to clean air and water, and historic environmental neglect, harm, or damage. But we've also allocated 10% just for low income. But to be clear, all communities will be able to apply for these funds. The Justice40 initiative is only kind of earmarking or setting aside 40% for historically disadvantaged communities, which are those that have been harmed by environmental neglect and damage or are low income. And so we are continuing to refine that process. The committee, if passed, would be making recommendations to the state of California on which projects should be funded. And so I'm excited and optimistic to see how this transfolds. We've stacked the committee with community voices, with impacted voices that are on the front lines, and that's not traditional for government. We like to put ourselves on committees to make decisions that we already had a chance to make. But I think when you center the people that have historically been neglected, forgotten, or impacted by failed policy, that's when you get the best results. And so that's what we're trying to do with AB 2419.
Assemblyman, what barriers still remain for equitable, sustainable development throughout the state?
So I'm thinking technical assistance is going to be one, right? There are some cities that have incredible leadership. They have the infrastructure departments like the Department of Civil Rights and others, incredible leadership to be able to take on billion-dollar investments and put them to work. There are other small, poor, rural cities across California, municipalities, counties, and others that don't have that infrastructure to be able to handle those kinds of large investments. So we're going to have to be mindful as a state, making sure we do this right, which is why we're housing the Justice40 task force in the Strategic Growth Council to make sure that we do this in a way that continues to build up everybody.
Great. It seems like your bill is going to have great impact. I think you mentioned civil rights, and to that end, I'd like to ask Attorney Maddox, what role do you think Los Angeles Civil Rights Department can and should play in helping to ensure federal and state investments are equitable in implementing in Los Angeles the program?
Well, thank you, Commissioner Davis. I really appreciate that question. I want to just take a moment to thank Marta for leading these crucial conversations on climate justice in Los Angeles. Of course, to hear Assemblymember Isaac Bryan for apologetically pushing in his leadership role on climate justice and making sure that everyone is involved in this space, particularly those communities that are harmed in a significant way. We need to definitely use our networks to bring real climate justice to Los Angeles and even the entire state. But Los Angeles is a message city, and we need to send the message on how things need to be done as it relates to climate justice. And you definitely can't have climate justice without climate equity. And it really shouldn't matter where you live, you know, as it relates to the opportunity for electric vehicles or walkable neighborhoods. And we can't just have those only be available to those that can afford them. So as the Assembly member said, we need, and Marta also said, we need to have the whole of government approach. And I really love and appreciate this conversation because making sure that we're not operating in silos, whereas, you know, polluters or the inequities of the past can thrive in one area versus another. We need to definitely rethink how government works and actually who it works for, and really being intentional, like the Assembly members discussed, being intentional to make sure that we have our partners and our community-based organizations at the table and not stacking boards and committees with you know, other people in government. The Civil Rights Department is very grateful in thinking of this mindset on how to work alongside CMO, the Climate Emergency Mobilization Office in this space. Really wanted to commend Mayor Eric Garcetti for his leadership, as well as the council for supporting both the Civil Rights Department as well as CMO for ensuring that, you know, climate justice starts with climate equity. And although our office cannot dictate where dollars can go, we can advocate where dollars will go through the equity lens on the city policy, and even being a voice for where these dollars go, even statewide, and working with some of our other partners from similarly situated departments throughout the state, and even in the national setting. We definitely want to always make sure that we're working with our partners because we know what happens when we are siloed and when we try to work independently. The Civil Rights Department has been tasked, just so you know, with a number of equity projects as it relates to city policy, the racial equity audit on, you know, how the city policies and procedures impact people from different races, making sure that there is equity in our disaster responses, and even applying the equity lens to the annual draft budget and so many other spaces. And I definitely want us to continue to to lift this work in some of our equity analysis. And sometimes we need to just put it out there in ways that people can't unsee things, as the assembly member was talking about the Cal environmental screen. That information and that data is used in so many ways and so many programs, including some of the work that we're doing with participatory budgeting. But basically, I want to get back to just say, as we think about Justice40 and bringing federal dollars to our impacted communities, we will be equity advocates all the way. And I hope that our fellow panelists, the folks that are leading things in our breakout rooms, as well as many of the members from the community that are on this call, will stand united with us as we use our voices to lift equity as it relates to climate emergencies. Thank you.
Very good. Director Segura, as we think about Justice40, what role does CMO play or can play to ensure federal state investments are equitably implemented in the city of Los Angeles?
Great. Thank you, Dr. Davis. And it's an honor to be here with Assemblymember Bryan and Capri Maddox, our founding director for the LA Civil Rights Department. I wanted to thank you all for doing all that you do and laying the groundwork for the city of Los Angeles to be able to have this conversation and hopefully move these policies forward. The Climate Emergency Mobilization Office, our main goal is to engage communities, particularly grassroots frontline communities, to be involved in the decision-making process and the advisory process of shaping equitable climate policies, right? So CMO gains its influence and it gains its momentum from these communities, from all the communities that have participated, for example, in the Climate Equity LA series, but also the coalitions that have helped to co-design the series and will be co-designing future programs for the Climate Emergency Mobilization Office in the future. I envision that the reporting of the data that we collect through this series will not just advise our commission, but it will advise our council and our strategies for the execution of climate vulnerability assessment, our hazard mitigation strategies, our climate action plan, which all require investments to ensure that not only are we adapting for climate resilience, but that we're reducing the social inequities in the most impacted communities. So very much like what Capri was saying for her department, we're an advocate and we're a voice. We lift up those voices from the communities, and our commission, which is launching in July, the Climate Emergency Mobilization Commission, is actually mandated to represent those most pollution burdened communities on its commission, in addition to climate experts, in addition to tribal Native Americans from this region, and labor and youth. So we have a good mix of representation on that commission that has experienced these climate impacts, environmental impacts, and environmental burdens that I think will be very representative and speak for, through those reports and through our engagement, speak clearly and authentically for those communities. So, CMO, I think, has a lot of hopefully future mandates as well, where we're going to be working collaboratively with other departments like Capri's, but also the Emergency Management Department, the Department of City Planning, Public Works, so that we do unsilo these investments and we do unsilo these policies, and we have this whole of government approach that is more coordinated than it has been in the past. So in some ways, I see CMO as a catalyst and a glue within the government to focus on climate and climate justice.
I think that each of the departments, both the Human Rights, Civil Rights and Human Rights Department, as well as CMO, have significant contributions to making sure that Justice40 is implemented in the most dynamic way to have a positive impact in Los Angeles. My question for the panel is, how can state and local governments proactively avoid the potential of unintended negative consequences of unprecedented investments in disadvantaged communities, such as potential displacement or gentrification. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think my first thought is not to think of any of these policies in a vacuum, right? The work we do on the environmental justice front impacts the housing front, impacts the labor front, impacts contact with the criminal legal system, and you can't solve one policy problem without thinking of the intersectionality between all the others. And so we have to continue to build more housing. We have to make sure that people remain in their homes. We have to make sure that we're making these investments in a way that uplift disadvantaged communities and not push out already struggling communities. And so I'm going to be mindful of that all the way through the process, and looking forward to collaborating with everybody, my partners in the city, like Capri, Maddox, and all of my colleagues here in the legislature, to make sure that we don't do that harm, that instead, when we have this kind of an unprecedented investment, that it only helps communities grow.
General Manager Maddox, you had some thoughts about.
Yes, and I definitely want to echo the Assemblymember Bryan's thoughts. He's someone that actually has lived experiences, that is in leadership, but we need to make sure that our leaders have a contact with the community, because impacted communities are in the best position to decide what works for their communities. Everyone deserves a safe and healthy neighborhood, but gentrification is a real issue. And I think that as we approach this with novel solutions, we can look at things like the participatory budgeting that the city of Los Angeles is doing. If you're not aware of what participatory budgeting is, it's giving communities resources and the power to decide how to improve their neighborhoods, so we don't end up developing and improving a neighborhood to benefit an outside audience. In the city of Los Angeles, I'll just let you know that the 9 areas that we're going to focus for the budgeting process are Pacoima, Panorama City, Westlake, West Adams, Leimert Park area, as well as Skid Row, Boyle Heights, South Los Angeles, and Southeast Los Angeles, along with the Wilmington Harbor Gateway areas. And we need to make, in this space, we're actually going to give $8.5 million the city council is going to release for community-based organizations, and these votes for what works and what's needed in the community will come from residents that sit on an advisory panel, and you'll hear more about that. That'll be launched this week with Mayor and next week with Mayor Garcetti. And I think it's important to know that we don't need just dollars, but again, giving people a real impact on how these dollars are spent. And the same thing I think should be done, or it can be done. We talk about, I believe Assemblymember Bryan said $44 billion. Some portion of that to be set aside, because we definitely don't want to, create displacement, and definitely solving one problem and yet creating another one. So I just wanted to echo those thoughts, and to say, if you are looking for a model, our participatory budgeting model that the city is doing, and this has been done at hundreds of other cities all over the world, may be a model that we can use here in this space.
Before we go to the audience for questions, Director Segura, any final thoughts in terms of what we can do to avoid negative consequences in unprecedented investments?
Yeah, I definitely want to echo Assemblymember Isaac Bryan and Capri Maddox, and want to lift up the idea of a community benefits plan, which is complementary, I think, to participatory budgeting process, where you really just, before you bring the infrastructure dollars in, or as you're bringing them in, and they're benefiting, say, utilities or corporations, we also need to ask, how are these dollars going to directly benefit the people that live here? And how are we going to ensure with this community benefits plan that we don't displace the individuals that live here? So say we bring more vegetation, we bring more trees, we bring more parks, we bring solar microgrids, all of that is amazing. But if the community is engaged and is writing its own community benefits plan as we invest this infrastructure, then we are in dialogue, we're in conversation with that community. And then we will be able to put the tools in before the development comes so that we can prevent that displacement, right? So it's got to be proactive, and it's got to engage the members of the community. And we have to think in terms of not just economics and how our businesses and corporations going to profit from these investments, but how are these investments going to directly impact communities.
Wonderful. Andreas Gonzalez, we're ready for some community engagement.
Excellent. Thank you, y'all. So the first question that we have here is, how will you ensure these funds have more oversight from impacted communities and provide for real community decision-making power?
Sounds like Assemblyman Bryan.
Yeah, so the best part, and don't tell too many people, but we have disproportionately stacked the Justice40 committee with people who are directly impacted. I'm talking, there's a seat for Native and Indigenous community members. There's a seat for environmental justice organizations. There's a seat for equity and justice focused community organizations working in a disadvantaged community. There are labor seats to make sure that working families are included. Everybody on this committee, if we pass this bill, and I suspect that we might, fingers crossed, is going to be somebody who tangentially is touched directly by these issues and has a very clear and valued perspective in the decision-making process of recommending projects. So that was clear to me on the onset, as it is to Capri Maddox. The people closest to the problems are closest to the solutions. So if we're going to create a committee, we've got to make sure it's stacked with those people.
Great. Andreas.
Cool. Thank you, Dr. Davis. And then I got another question here. Thinking about other activity going on in our state, what connection, if any, do you see between AB 2419, LA Civil Rights Department, and the California Reparations Task Force, which has included environmental justice in scope of its study?
Well, that sounds like Capri Maddox as well as everybody else.
Yes, thank you so much for that question. But again, you know, justice has been delayed and justice has been denied for far too long, especially for the communities that have been wronged for far too long. And I think it is important for us to know that, particularly with the Civil Rights Department, we're looking to be sure to not allow an inequity to slide on either side. So that is why when the department was created, we wanted to be intentional to look at, you know, the intersections of injustice everywhere they touch, whether it's on impacting people's upward mobility or discrimination. We have the ability to actually bring cases against folks that violate your civil rights in the areas of commerce, education, employment, and housing. We have we have a number of commissions, including the Commission on Civil Rights, the Commission on the Status of Women, the Transgender Advisory Commission, as well as the Human Relations Commission and Reparations Commission. And I think it is important to know that by bringing a number of you know, problems that need to be solved, whether it's, you know, a climate issue or reparations, we need to be sure that we're intentional as government. We can't unsee what has happened. And I'll just also remind everyone that unfortunately, government was involved in some of the injustices that we see. When you think about segregated schools or redlining, or, you know, just the fact that some planning issues on where we have food deserts until this day, or where we built freeways. I mean, you can look at those maps from the 1930s and see how, you know, communities were redlined, and then we saw where freeways were placed, and now you can, you know, overlay any map from the Cal Enviro screen maps to you know, where poverty is, or where the COVID-19 crisis harmed the most people in our city, in our region, in our state. And so I think it is important for us to know that we need to be intentional with our solutions and make sure that we check every place where inequity touches, because if we leave it alone, it will never leave us alone. And that's something that I think we can't unsee that now, and government needs to step up. And especially while we have the wind at our backs with support from leaders in the assembly, like Assemblymember Bryan, leaders in Los Angeles, like Mayor Garcetti, and then of course the dollars that are coming with Justice40 from the White House with the current administration, the Biden-Harris team. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent. Director Segura, followed by Assemblyman Bryan.
Great. Well, I don't think I can add much more than what Capri has said, except to say that it's going to be critically important for cities across the state to try to use best practices and perhaps model what the city of Los Angeles is doing, so that they too can prioritize these equitable investments. And that's definitely something I think the city of Los Angeles hopes to do by using the CalEnviro screen tools, the EJ screening tools, and by using this whole of government approach to ensure that the guardrails that these communities are recommending are used to create equitable climate policies across the city. And so all of those different multifaceted approaches need to be combined. And I'm really glad that we're aligning here, and symbolically the federal, state, and local leaders that can advocate for those types of changes.
Assemblyman Bryan.
Just echo everything that's been said already.
Okay, great.
It's really exciting to me that we're in a time right now where we are actually setting up committees and task forces to plan on how we address historic divestment, redress the impacts of slavery. I mean, all of these things, and we're coupling them with resources, right? Oftentimes we have these conversations, we recognize the problems, we see the gaps, and then we don't do enough to fill them. In this case, particularly with Justice40, we've got $44 billion coming to California, and we've got to make sure that a disproportionate share of that goes to the communities that have historically been left out, and we're going to do that.
Wonderful. Andreas, do we have any other community engagement inquiries or discussion?
Yeah, I think we've touched on this, but let's see. So we got one question. Race is the #1 predictor of exposure to environmental pollution. Do you foresee being able to execute AB 2419 with the racial equity lens, given Prop 209 still stands?
Okay.
No. I wish I could say we need to make sure some of this money goes to Black, Brown, poor, and Indigenous communities. But you've got to find creative proxies to cover that. And so disadvantaged is one of those metrics that we're operationalizing to do that. But we know it's the same Black and Brown communities that live closest to environmental hazards, that have the lowest performing and invested schools, that have the fewest quality grocery stores, that have the highest police presence, right? All of these things are compounded in the same neighborhoods, and we've got to address those. But unfortunately, because of 209, we've got to get creative sometimes on what the framework looks like that we're able to address those. And so with Justice40, we've used disadvantaged, and we're going to try to operationalize it in a way that targets those very same communities.
I think that is certainly apropos, given 209 and the things that we have to do in its application in all of our projects and programs across the board. In contracting, it's the same thing. And I think you all have done an outstanding job in crafting the bill and targeting disadvantage, because many of the very communities that we have concerned about are disadvantaged. Any other thoughts about the question from General Manager Maddox or Director Segura?
Sure. I just wanted to echo the answer that was provided by the Assembly member. Even when we were preparing our work for the participatory budgeting, we looked at a number of factors. I talked about the CalEnviro screen, looking at unemployment rates, looking at rent burdens, looking at poverty, education levels, as well as pollution and hazards that are in neighborhoods. We came out with this with the same numbers that put us in a position where 87% of the residents in those neighborhoods were people of color, primarily African American and Latino. And so I'll just say this, they made it easy for us to target impacted communities by doing the same harms and the same wrongs, so that we can be now very intentional on how to serve these communities. And it's no mistake that your skin color determines how the environment impacts your life, and impacts so many other things, as Director Segura as well as Assemblymember Bryan have shared with us today.
Hey, do we have a final question, and Andreas from the audience?
Yeah.
If
So let me just 1 second. And just as a reminder, we're super good on time. So just for
okay, great.
translators, feel free to, speakers, just speak, in a
Okay.
conversational cadence. To just help
Great.
Yeah, if you don't mind, Dr. Davis, I wanted to give a specific example
Sure,
of
absolutely.
how Los Angeles hopes to lessen inequalities. We're in this next fiscal year, we're collaboratively with EMD, DCP, and other bureaus and departments creating this climate vulnerability assessment with a social vulnerability focus. And we discovered that the Office of Planning and Research's maps of climate hazards in LA were inaccurate. So what we hope to do with this climate vulnerability assessment is bring better data to those state maps, so that when we're applying for funds for climate hazards in Los Angeles, particularly extreme heat and heat storms, that none of the communities that deserve those funds are left out. But it was a lesson that I learned when I was looking at the state's vulnerability map for risks, that so many communities were left out of that risk map. And that determines whether you can apply for those FEMA funds, those Cal OES funds, and other funds that we're going to need to prepare Los Angeles for the growing heat and the drought that we are going to disproportionately experience. And I just wanted to point out that in Wilmington, in the South Bay, we have 60% of the refineries that exist in the state. So that region actually has this extreme burden of not just heat, but of exposure. And we're all going to experience drought this summer like we haven't in the past, because we're also going to put the risk of the wildfires on top of that. So LA is doing everything that it can to prepare for the summer, but I wanted to give that example of how city government can prepare and collaborate with the state to ensure that those funds are accessed.
Great. Will local governments be able to identify disadvantaged communities within their jurisdiction based upon criteria, as long as it doesn't directly conflict with the state's definition of disadvantaged communities?
I think that's what I was just talking about. Like, we have disadvantaged communities that are experiencing climate hazards, but because the state's map does not reflect those climate hazards in their map, and it's getting there. And OPR understands that it needs to revise its maps, but that's a good example of how we need to be in alignment so that we can access those resources.
Great. Any other feedback on that point? Great. Well, how might the state and the city, we talked about some of working together and collaborating, but how might we specifically incorporate input from communities? We have in the past had advisory councils. We've had numerous ways in which we get input from communities. Has anyone explored any specific tool that we would be able to employ to help get the community more engaged when Justice40 does take place?
Well, I think one of the things that I will always push for is a participatory process. So open forums, community meetings in a way that's accessible for community at times that are accessible for community, so that we're going throughout the state and really getting that true impact. Obviously, the committee is going to have tremendous lived experience and direct insight, but I think that's not always enough. You need to still be out in community, listening, gathering information. And so as long as I have any influence on the process, I will be pushing for that kind of transparency and openness.
Right.
Has there been any other city or municipality that has used a formula similar to what we are proposing in the state of California? Obviously, those of us who have been in the legislature knows that they say in the legislature, so goes California, so goes the nation. So where do we fit into this Justice 40 idea in terms of the rest of the country? Are we leading the way in this concept, or is someone else doing it?
No, we're leading the way. And we might even be leading the White House, who is still going into this process themselves. And so the framework that we established could have tremendous weight and influence on how they establish kind of a national framework for their priorities. And we have some advisory representatives who are very close to what's going on in DC. And so we're working in collaboration. But to your point, Mr. Davis, so goes California, so goes the rest of the country. And we plan on leading from Los Angeles, especially.
Great. Do any of you anticipate any difficulty in terms of us getting our message out about inclusion and about the significance of us having equity in this area of service that we are providing?
I think the message won't be as hard as operationalizing our values of community engagement, because it's really, we've learned through this process and this blueprint that CMO has been co-designing with communities that we have to invest for them to be able to facilitate, for them to be able to co-design the process, for them to be able to execute the focus groups and the listening sessions. And it's an investment that city has invested in, but it's not inexpensive. It costs money to ensure that communities are participating and that they're leading the participation. So I just wanted to point out that it's part of a distributional justice model to ensure that we fund CBOs and community leaders to participate in the process, right?
Wonderful, wonderful. Andreas, any other thoughts from the audience?
Yeah, I just wanted to flag one last question. The question is, how can we follow the proceedings actions of the Justice 40 task force? But maybe just to add on to that, maybe how can we follow the work of everyone's respective offices here as well?
Well, to start with the task force, there is no Justice 40 committee yet. We have made it through our policy committees on the Assembly side. We're picking up co-authors, we're picking up momentum. We are in the Assembly Appropriations Committee right now. So call Assemblymember Holden if you want to. Let him know this is an important bill for you. He knows it's an important bill for me. We had a conversation about it yesterday. And so I'm hopeful that it comes off the suspense file and goes to the full Assembly floor. But even if it does that process and we're able to lift this off the Assembly floor, it goes through the Senate Policy Committee process as well. So stay engaged all the way through. Track my office, follow us online. It's going to take everybody to move this forward. And so we haven't won anything yet. And they often don't give us the resources that we deserve. And so we're going to have to fight this all the way to the finish line.
Wonderful, wonderful. Andreas, that was the last from community?
Maybe if Director Maddox and Marta want to share how we can kind of follow the work of their offices too, just to kind of wrap a bow on it.
Sure. I was going to, yeah, absolutely.
Yes, thank you so much for this opportunity to share information about our office. I do know we have some of it in the chat. However, I'm going to be very clear that you can follow us at civilandhumanrights.lacity.org. And if you go to our website, even, pop to our website right now, please sign up for our newsletter. It comes out every other Monday. And that's the only time we really reach out to our listserv. And I'd like to also let you all know that you can follow us on social media at LA Civil Rights. That is your Facebook, Instagram, and our Twitter accounts. And then you can even follow us on LinkedIn as well at LA Civil Rights. You can also reach us by phone, 213-978-8255. 1845 is our phone number. And for those that are in the Civic Center area, we are down below City Hall in the LA Mall. We actually just built out what was formerly known as the Hallmark store down in the LA Mall. And we also converted, which was vacant, and we also used a vacant storefront that was used as a Dalton bookstore previously, and that is now the John Lewis Conference Center, built state of the art, and we just were able to open at the end of last year. So super grateful to be accessible for the community, and definitely I know that we have a lot of involved neighborhood council members on this call, and I really wanted to shout out a big thanks to the members of the community that are, making their voices heard. And I want to let you know that for as much work as it is for neighborhood council, to make a commitment, especially those that are elected officers there, just know that when we're talking about getting money out to communities, we are not going to burden people with making long-term, commitments to help us in this space, but to be sure to be intentional, to understand that we have a lot of working parents in this space too, and we want those voices to be heard. And I know it's a juggle for all working. I'm a working mom too, so I just wanted to let you all know that we're excited about being accessible for the community in so many ways, and the Civil Rights Department is proud to partner with not only our state elected officials, but our CMO family. So thank you so much, Marta.
Great. Well, this is where I tell you we've just been around for 1 year. So at the moment, my team and I are creating our new website. We have a landing page now, and I'll have my staff put the landing page there. But what we'll do is, since we have all of you in our database, we'll let you know as soon as our website is available. Will you get access to all of these recordings, access to all of the materials, all of the programs that we have initiated. And in addition to that, the plans that we have for the future when we have events, and next year we hope to have in-person events, in-person community assemblies, and crossing our fingers that the pandemic continues to improve so that we can go back to the old school way of seeing all of you in person, in addition to these virtual events that have made us more accessible.
Assemblyman Bryan, any final words?
I'm just grateful to all of the work for everybody on the ground, everybody in the community, and the collaboration between multiple levels of government. There is no single problem in our communities that the city can solve alone. There's no problem that the county can solve alone, and there's no problem that the state can solve alone. And so you need thoughtful partners. You need angelic troublemakers in all those places. And so I'm grateful to work alongside all of you, and thank you for having me today.
I would like to conclude by saying I am both proud and impressed with each and every one of you. Capri's, the work that you're doing is just simply outstanding, and it's absolutely timely when we talk about injustice and equity. And Marta, how proud I am of you to bring it to the environmental applications that we have in the climate emergency mobilization efforts. And of course, you, Assemblyman Bryan, you are leading the way as they do in the state legislature. And you have a national model here that we know that working with your best city, Los Angeles, you're going to be able to prove that this is a project demonstrating excellence. And so I am so grateful for the opportunity to have increased my own awareness about climate emergency mobilization this day. And I know that those who are participating have done the same. Thank you all so very much. And as Dr. King said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
You all.
Thank you. Wonderful.
We do okay?
Yeah, we're good. Is Andres, should I transition now and introduce?
Yeah, so we'll be transitioning into the second roundtable, Marta. So you're back to moderating, are you?
Wonderful. So again, thank you, Assemblymember Isaac Bryant, Dr. Davis, and Capri Maddox, Esquire, General Manager of the Civil, Human Rights and Equity Department for the City of LA. But I think that now we are going to transition into our next roundtable. And we have two wonderful speakers, Agustin Cabrera, the Policy Director for Scope, and Estuardo Mazariegos, the Campaign Manager for RePower LA. And we're going to actually be discussing very similar issues, but from the community perspective. When we're just waiting for them to come to the forefront. Any second now. Give us a moment. Thank you. Welcome, Estuardo and Agustin. We're so pleased to have you here, and especially after that really amazing roundtable. I'm sure you have ideas and thoughts that you'd like to share. And why don't we start with you, Agustin? Because you are Scope is a co-sponsor of the California Justice40 Act. So we want to know how Scope sees this bill impacting communities and where it works, and how will communities see and feel these changes?
Yeah, thank you, Marta. And to the previous panel, it was really enlightening and really grateful for this really productive dialogue. So, Scope is very excited to work with the Assembly member on AB 2419, or the California Justice40 Act, and our co-sponsors across the state, the California Green New Deal Network, APEN, and the Green Lining Institute. And why we decided to be co-sponsors is because for decades, South LA has been a testing ground for racist policies. Really, the social and economic conditions of our community and many other Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities across the state have been forced to survive with limited public services and infrastructure spending. So the legacy of redlining, deindustrialization, and neoliberal policies have caused gross economic disparities, systemic poverty, gentrification, displacement, inadequate education and healthcare, and of course, severe pollution, as folks mentioned. So these problems aren't just a thing of the past, they continue to burden our communities. As an example, in 2017, South LA council districts 8, 9, and 10 only received about 7% of the over $241 million invested in bridges, streets, whereas downtown Los Angeles, our neighboring district, received 25% of those investments, right? And we've seen how gentrified and how developed by corporate landlords downtown has become, and so really that gross disparity is there. And the blatant disinvestment in Black and Brown communities like South LA should no longer be acceptable, right? We need targeted policies like Justice40 that help undo the decades of harm that our communities have experienced. So as the city takes bold steps to address the climate crisis, such as phasing out neighborhood oil drilling, which was achieved through a decade's worth of organizing efforts from Scope members and our allies in Stand LA, the city must prioritize communities like South LA, which ranks really high amongst the top 10% of most polluted census tracts in the state. So, the Assembly member really highlighted that historical disinvestment and pollution. And so our communities live near unregulated polluting industries, are enclosed by freeways. And these conditions are major contributors to poor health outcomes like asthma, cancer, and other chronic diseases. And to make things even more worse, South LA lacks the kind of infrastructure that could protect residents from these exposures, such as green spaces and parks. So in South LA alone, we only have about 0.9 acres of open green space that's afforded to every 1,000 residents, well short of the 10-acre goal established by the City Council. So as we transition away from the extractive industries that have plagued us for decades, we must act quickly to build infrastructure such as parks and safer roads that capture water and create good paying union jobs for our residents. And at Scope, we believe that California Justice40 is the first step in achieving real equity in LA, not only because it centers burdened communities, but because it also creates an accountability task force, as the Assembly member mentioned, that will be made up of folks from South LA, from other EJ communities, and from Indigenous communities to make sure that these commitments are actualized. So, in closing, I think the targeted investment that Justice40 can bring to South LA will improve the economic and environmental outcomes and conditions of workers and communities in South LA.
Thank you, Agustin. That was a lot to process in such a short amount of time. And I'm really glad that you brought up how important it is to bring equitable investments to South Los Angeles, for example. And you gave us statistics about how it compares to areas like downtown Los Angeles. I didn't even know that. I had no idea that that statistic was so drastic. But it's a very real and concrete example of what we're talking about here today. So thank you. And so next I'll go to Estuardo. Estuardo, how do we ensure that work and jobs that are created by these incoming investments are good jobs and that the workers that live in those frontline communities are benefiting?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Hello, everyone. First, I want to thank everyone at home for attending this meeting. It's not easy to come home from a long day of work and sit down and plan the future of the city. And because of that, this is what you all are doing right now, which is planning the future of our great city. And although we are a great city with great people, our people are suffering right now. The poverty rate in Los Angeles is about 20%. That means that 1 out of every 5 Angelenos is living on the line of poverty. 790,000 of our folks are living in poverty. And that means that we have to do a lot of work with this Justice40 to make sure that we uplift as many of those folks living on poverty and that we must boost and create a new economy that's inclusive of everyone and that uplifts those amongst us that are most in need. From my personal experience, I'm a Guatemalan immigrant, came here when I was 3 years old. My family struggled for many years, living in overcrowded conditions, sometimes in slum housing, and other times having to choose between paying the bills and buying food, putting food on the table. The only jobs that my parents could get for a very long time were exploitive jobs that would steal the wages and treat them as disposable people. All of that changed though. When they got work at a hospital with a good union contract, all of a sudden we could afford our own apartment, have quality food, health insurance, and my parents had dignified working conditions. This is why I think it's incredibly important that we bring in as many of our labor partners into this particular conversations, because without our brothers and sisters from the labor movement, the workers' voices, our community's voices, won't be heard as loudly as possible. So this is why I am advocating right now to bring in as many of our folks as possible to advocate for AB 2419, to be at the inception of this conversation so we have skin in the game. Right now, my family is literally on strike at Cedars-Sinai as we speak, and they're fighting for dignified working conditions. And they're on strike so they could get a contract after all the work they've done. The only way they're gonna be able to get the respect that they deserve is because they have a collective voice. And I really do believe that if we bring that same energy from the labor movement into this conversation, even if it means kicking and screaming sometimes, that we'll be able to build the type of future that we need. Secondly, we should use our institutions like the LA Trade Tech, which I'm an alum of Los Angeles Trade Tech. I got trained professionally as an HVAC technician, so I'm an air conditioning expert. So if anybody out there has any issues with the air conditioning, you can call me. I've still got my EPA universal certificate, so I know all of it already. And I still get calls from my friends to talk about, like, exactly how can they retrofit their air conditioning. And I say this because it's coming from a community member. I live in the 9th district, and it takes our people to be able to uplift our folks and to be able to build the infrastructure that we need. If we're the frontline community and we're being impacted the most by the climate change, then it should be us fixing this problem. It should be us benefiting from the work, and it should be good work. It should be union standard work. And I definitely, using those institutions like Los Angeles Trade Tech, putting it up to scale and making sure that we bring in the folks from those communities to train them at those places, and including other programs like the utility pre-craft training out of IBEW Local 18 to make sure that those folks are also getting scaled up and have the resources to be able to train as many people as possible and reach into the community and pull out the workers that we need to train the folks that are being impacted by this the most. I was just looking up. We're potentially getting $29 billion from the government program to rebuild our highways. All of that work to rebuild the highways, to maintain the highways, should be done by the people that live by the highways, to make sure that we lift those folks out of poverty. We must make sure that it is our communities that be impacted the most by the climate change. And it's also our communities that should be benefiting the most from the incoming investments because of the fight that we have going on right now to make sure that we survive this climate change, right? So we need to create a sustainable economic model in this new adventure that we have going on as our city. Our people deserve it. I don't care that anyone says our city and our region is the anchor of one of the largest economies in the world. It won't be what it should be until we pull out as many of those 790,000 Angelenos out of poverty. We deserve more, and this is an opportunity to do that. This is an opportunity to change the narrative in our city and really recreate it in the image of us, the workers, really recreate it in the image of what makes this economic engine run. Our city is the bedrock of California, and where we go, the rest of the state goes, and where the rest of the state goes, the rest of the country goes. So we need to be able to have a voice in this to lift up our people out of poverty.
Great. Well, our next question was supposed to be about how do you suggest we avoid the unintended negative consequences of these investments in our communities? But because of what you were saying, Estuardo, and you too, Agustin, I'm thinking it would be really great to give a maybe specific example, how jobs can help. What kinds of jobs and what kinds of programs can help us avoid those unintended consequences? Or Agustin, what kinds of programs do you recommend or policies do you recommend that will help to avoid those negative unintended consequences? And why don't we go ahead and start with Agustin?
Yeah,
One
thanks
second.
about that. And go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt, Agustin. Just as a friendly reminder, if we can just kind of speak, at a slow cadence, just for our interpreters. Really appreciate the passion, mad respect for y'all, just so that they can, kind of process it a little bit easier. Just really appreciate y'all. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Andres.
That's all.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question, and thank you, Estuardo, for uplifting sort of workers in this conversation. I think, workers are tenants, workers are people what live in frontline communities, so we can't separate them. And so I think you did a really good job of kind of highlighting some programs that could put people to work that live in the communities that we're focused on, like the utility pre-craft training program, like the local hired and targeted program within the city. But I do want to, and maybe save some time for Estuardo to actually kind of elaborate more. But I think what I did want to say is that, our approach to, the climate crisis has to be intersectional. It has to, involve labor. It has to involve housing and tenant rights, frontline communities, racial and equity, organizations, and community. And so I did reach out to our partners at SAGE, a tenant and housing rights advocacy group, so that I could actually answer this question with some tangible actions that the city can take, right? Because I think someone mentioned it in the chat, like, what can we actually do, right? I think a lot of times we hear like, we need to make sure that we, put safeguards to prevent gentrification or displacement. And that's just sort of the talking point, but people don't actually have sort of those actionable items. So I think what was suggested is that, the city could really do three things, right? First, invest in the enforcement of existing protections by increasing the capacity of the local housing department with increased funding and staffing. So really beefing up the housing department. Second, pass more tenant protections such as right to counsel, a Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act or TOPA, regulations on corporate landlords, creating enforcement mechanisms for the tenant anti-harassment ordinance, and making sure property owners that harass or try to illegally evict tenants are penalized. And then lastly, and for any programs that direct investment to communities at risk for gentrification and displacement, to make sure the program has elements like tenant protections. Community-based organizations are part of enrollment and outreach, and direct lines of communication are made with the city's local housing department. And so just to put a real emphasis on that, as community-based organizations are working together in coalition like LEAP LA, like RePower, also the city has to work together across departments, the housing, DWP, building and safety. They have to work together to really create solutions that won't impact residents, workers, or frontline communities.
Thank you, Agustin. That was so clear and so concise at the same time. I think it is definitely time for cities, not just Los Angeles, across the state and across the nation, to implement some of those enforcement mechanisms and fund the enforcement mechanisms, because often we get these unfunded mandates and we ask for enforcement, but there's no enforcement capacity. So I appreciate you highlighting that. So Estuardo, we turn to you again, and I think you've taken up the mantle for labor and workforce. Please share. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll slow down. I know that was probably me speaking too fast, but thank you for the reminder on that. And yes, I definitely am a labor supporter and labor person. My family, again, is a labor family, and we have the standard of living that we have because of labor. And because of that, I definitely will uplift, including our partners within society that are labor organizations within these conversations, especially when it comes to legislation. I think it's proven record that the more that we include and have a voice and build coalition with labor folks, the easier it is to get the policies that we need done. And I think that it's really important to bridge those gaps. And I know there's been a struggle in this conversation, and I know there has been a gap in this conversation between environmental and labor, but I think the time is now to close that gap. And if we don't close that gap, we will continue having the same issue and creating the same broken systems that put our people down. But I also want to uplift what Agustin has said in terms of protecting the folks that are most vulnerable. As a former housing organizer as well, I know how important it is for folks to know their rights, to have a right to counsel when they go into eviction court, to make sure that they have access to health screenings at their apartments, to make sure that they know their rights as tenants. And another thing I really do want to highlight is in terms of avoiding the negative impacts of so much money coming into our neighborhoods, coming into our communities, is talking directly to the folks. So participatory budgeting is a huge step that we can take. And it's a big process, and it takes a big investment to have the right type of conversation with the community, to capture the voices and make sure that we get the money where it's needed. But I think it's a worthwhile process. And it's a process that would only benefit us as a city and as a region to include as many voices as possible. And we can tap our organizations that are already in place and already highly organized, like the Scopes of the world, like the Sages of the world, Pacoima Beautifuls of the world, to drive that participatory budgeting process forward. And it means resourcing them well enough to be able to do that as well. And I think we already have models within the city to do that, like the people's budgeting process. And we saw a lot of those outcomes during the pandemic, when we were able to shift a lot of the money that was being spent in our county and our city to be redeployed in emergency facilities or emergency ways, because of the people who rose up and said, right now is the time to rethink the way that we spend our budgeting, right? So I think those are some of the answers.
Yeah, great. And just to remind our audience, what we're talking about here is the city's intentions to decarbonize buildings in Los Angeles, which means retrofitting buildings if we want to make them greener. Los Angeles also has a goal of zero carbon emissions with our LA 100 strategy at LADWP. And although those are both promising policies to reduce carbon emissions, we want to, what I think both of you are suggesting is that we have these guardrails for tenants and for workers and for vulnerable communities, so that these investments that we're making in Los Angeles to making it cleaner and greener don't also have the consequence of making poverty worse, displacements worse, but actually use it as an opportunity to strengthen Los Angeles and to have it be the shining example of how when we brought in infrastructure investments to make Los Angeles healthier for everyone, that it also strengthened everyone and it ensured that workers got paid better and that tenants had more rights. So those are some of the ideals that I hear both of you requesting, and I just wanted to make sure that those in the audience that were new understood what the tension was in terms of the policies that are being proposed by the city of LA. And I wanted to thank you both so much. And I want to remind everybody, if you didn't catch everything that Agustin and Estuardo said, we will have recordings and we will send them to this entire group. And you can share them with your community organizations and your grassroots leaders. And we'll also have recordings in Spanish. And in the future, we intend to have them in other languages as well. So Agustin, Estuardo, thank you for honoring us with your presence and with your wisdom. And now I guess we're going to transition into the engagement portion of our virtual events, which is the small group sessions, where everyone will have an opportunity to participate in the discussion and let us know what you're thinking about this discussion as a whole. So I'll hand it over to Andres, and again, Estuardo, Agustin, thank you so much.
Oh, thanks, y'all, and many blessings. So right now we're going to enter breakout rooms that will last about 30 minutes. I remind facilitators to please turn on your cameras, and I encourage everyone to please turn on your cameras for this part. We'll have 3 questions that I'm going to share in the chat. The first question is, where do you think these federal, sorry, I think I clicked the wrong thing here. The first question is, where do you think these federal infrastructure and climate investments should go in LA? What do you think these federal infrastructure and climate investments should be used for, and how do you think these federal investments can be best leveraged? And then finally, what do you think the city should do to avoid any potential unintended consequences of directing federal infrastructure and climate investments, such as gentrification or displacement? Are there other consequences you foresee? And I included those in English and Spanish. So before we go, I remind everyone to please turn on your cameras, encourage participation in this. If you are in the wrong language room, you have an option to exit that room and come back to this main room. And we can assign you then to the correct language room for you. And with that, Giselle, if we can open up breakout rooms for 30 minutes. Thank you. Thank you so much. Really appreciate that. Gracias a todos. Bienvenidos. If we can open up the interpretation channels again, just to make sure that's working. Thank you. Un recuerdito a todos para que abren de nuevo el globito y pueden elegir el idioma de preferencia, por favor. Gracias. Solo que eso reempieza cada vez que uno sale en los cuartos. So just a reminder, if you can go into the little globe at the bottom and pick your correct channel. Thank you all for this last round of breakout rooms for this part of the Climate Equity LA series. And with that, I will ask 3 facilitators to, if they can kind of share back any key takeaways. As a reminder, keeping folks anonymous, just kind of sharing high level points, please. And first, if we can have oh, I'm sorry, I think we have is that Fabian? Yeah, let's make sure we have interpreters in the appropriate channels. Yeah, perfect. I don't hear y'all. Okay, excellent. Thank you. Marta, if you would like to start us off, and then afterwards we'll pass it to Gloria, and then Laura. Just high level points in like 2 or 3 minutes, please. Thank you.
Sure. So our group had a pretty good discussion. Hi, everyone. My name is Marta. So on the first question, which is where do you think these federal infrastructure and climate investments should go in LA? Folks mentioned that it should go to righting the wrongs of the past that exists with respect to historic disinvestment, and that the federal infrastructure investment should go to disadvantaged communities. There was a lot of emphasis and interest in community organic gardens. There are a lot of food deserts in the county, so we need more healthy foods. The need for more parks and green spaces as well, and more tree canopies was a main point that was raised as well. And then ensuring that the money goes to public projects, not to private investments. And so for the second question, which is around what do you think these federal infrastructure and climate investments should be used for? Again, there was just a lot of emphasis on the need for investments to go to the most disadvantaged communities. A lot of interest and dialogue around rooftop solar and ensuring that corporate landlords don't suck up all the subsidies for their low-income residents, and how we need to means test landlords, especially if we means test homeowners as well. We need to plant the right trees as well, maintain them, coordinate. In thinking about like resilience hubs and what models of resilience hubs can look like across the city, folks mentioned, having more public pools, as a form of like pooling centers for the community. And then also really thinking about how schools can be utilized as resilience hubs as well. On the last question around, what does it mean to avoid any potential unintended consequences? Folks listed a bunch of things, including, having eviction protections, right of return, inclusionary zoning, right to counsel, expansion of rent control, creation of social housing, and enforcement of the home sharing ordinance. There was emphasis around the need for, guiding principles, but really, ensuring that, these laws and programs were being enforced, and that there was community oversight as well. The more people you get involved in the process, the better, and we need to get people educated and engaged on all of these issues as well. And folks also mentioned just the need for EV charging stations in South LA, and just how to make sure that those are equitable and accessible to all Angelinos. So just high level key points and key takeaways. So I'll pass it back to you, Andres.
Perfect. Thank you, Marta. That was super rich. And Gloria, if you'd like to kind of share key takeaways in about like 1 or 2 minutes, please.
Yes, absolutely. I'll try to keep it as short as possible because there was a richness of information that you can only get from experts on the ground, folks who live and are raising their families in South LA and then Los Angeles, right? Some of the things, the key things that came up in terms of investment or where the money should go, folks talked about the ocean, the beaches, the experience of families going to the beach and the amount of trash that's in the ocean, and really a concern about our stormwater systems and whether they are actually if they're effective in keeping our oceans clean. There was also conversation about parks, even in areas, there was obviously elevation that there's not enough green space, not enough parks in our communities, but even in where there are parks, a lot of times they're fenced out because of the way that, folks are dealing with keeping the parks clean. And so that we need to find better ways of making those parks accessible. Folks also elevated urban oil drilling, really just continuing to elevate that it continues to be a problem for community members, their health, asthma, and just other illnesses, cancer, that is a real problem for community members. Also elevating the infrastructure just as a whole, thinking of roads and streets. They are in dire need for repair. And there was a very a good suggestion about vegetation or greening the entrances of our freeway, making sure that there's enough greenery, trees around our highways, our polluting freeways, to be able to help minimize that. There was a lot of conversation about housing. I won't go into the details, but just to elevate affordability is a huge issue for folks. They're very concerned about the developments that are going on up, and sometimes in the name of affordable housing, and for community members feeling like it's not affordable and it's not for them. And so folks gave examples about, if you try to get into an affordable housing unit that is going up, a lot of times they are asking about immigrants, their immigrant status, their credit rating. They're asking for very large deposit, which is not really within the means of folks. I think in terms of the best way to leverage and making sure that we don't have any unintended consequences, the one thing I will say, there was a lot there, but the one thing I would say that folks kept on elevating was equity, that there needs to be a commitment for a partnership between the city and communities to work together on both ends, right? The community being able to engage community members in a genuine way, and communities being able to also be part of the solution.
Thank you, Gloria. And then Laura, we're really pressed on time, but maybe if you just want to kind of put a couple points in a minute or so, that would be awesome.
Yeah, for sure. So for the first one, folks, really, there was a good question of like, how are these funds and how is the city of Los Angeles going to partner or collaborate or be in conversation with the county of Los Angeles, recognizing that a lot of folks, who may have lived in LA are now living in, have moved to surrounding cities, or in general, how are we making sure that tenants across the region are being protected? There was also a very all across the board understanding that all of these funds need to be prioritized for community members, and that none of it is going to subsidize any of the changes to corporations, and that as we are doing retrofits and as we are doing this transition, that tenants are supported throughout that transition. And that was kind of similar in some of the other questions. Something that folks also similarly, folks recognize that it's going to be difficult. It's going to be a transition, right? It takes a while to adjust to some of these changes. And as we do, we just need to make sure that we're being really intentional in working with communities so that the transition is supporting them, and that they understand, how are these changes being made? How is it impacting me? And how am I being supported? What resources are available to me? I think that's a pretty good, yeah.
Thank you so much, Laura. And with that, I'll pass it off to Marta to just kind of discuss where this is all going and what are the next steps.
Great. Thank you, everyone. I really want to appreciate, again, all of the CBOs, the anchor organizations, the facilitators, the note takers, the Liberty Hill Foundation, the City of Los Angeles, Mayor Eric Garcetti, Councilmember Koretz for having helped to spearhead CMO, and all of the other council members who actually listened to the community and the LEAP LA Coalition and created this office so that we could not just be here to engage you, but to integrate your voices into the decision-making process. So the next step is for us to take all of this information from the small groups, from the surveys, from the focus groups, from the listening sessions that the LEAP LA Coalition is also facilitating, to combine that, put that into a recommendations and findings report, and present it at the July 19th meeting for the launch of the Climate Emergency Mobilization Commission that, as mentioned earlier, is very representative of the frontline communities, labor, youth, Native American tribes, climate experts. And so we are very hopeful that this commission will then take that information and present it to the council as we move forward in creating more equitable climate policies through our climate vulnerability assessment, our climate action plan, our heat action plan, and all of it is intersected with the discussions that we had here on community-driven climate resilience, on ensuring that decarbonization brings equitable practices and as anti-displacement in our all across Los Angeles. I just have so much gratitude in my heart for everyone that's here. I wish I could name everybody by name because they're all equally valuable and you've made this work. The next step after that, we're going to have a reflection and visioning process to ensure that whatever we did this year, we improve upon for next year. And we're going to have a Climate Equity LA series next year, but we're probably going to integrate more grassroots engagement strategies that will be recommended by the anchor organizations that have been involved in the design of this process. So we're just going to continue, I hope, to improve, to ensure the voices are lifted and that these policies are equitable and that we see the kind of Los Angeles that we have been dreaming of. And I want to thank again everyone who has participated. I know you've done this from your heart and it's a passion point for you, and rest assured that it is for me. One thing I haven't mentioned in the past is that when I was 14, my whole neighborhood was demolished. My entire neighborhood was demolished for an expressway and to place a children's museum right where my house was. And now when I go back, it's really sad because I can't go back home. There is no home for me. And I remember how traumatizing that was for me and all of the hundreds of families that were displaced to make room for this new San Jose, the Silicon Valley that completely excluded us. So this is something that is very important to me and I'm committed to you, and thank you again for your participation. And with that, I'll reintroduce on this. I think he was going to do a mentee.
Yeah, I know folks are going, but almost as a goodbye mentee poll, if you want to just provide your final thoughts on what is one thing that you'd really like to see here, or what is a plethora of things, but just kind of almost think of it as a guest book as you exit to just kind of share any thoughts. And we'll also have another survey that'll probably pop up after this presentation closes, or after the Zoom closes. So if you want to leave any final thoughts, I shared it in the chat. Or feel free to also just share it in the share directly into the chat as well. And thank you everyone so much for this entire series. We really appreciate you all. Bendiciones wherever you are. And thank you so much, as well as shout out to Marta and Rebecca and the entire CMO office for just all the work that y'all do, as well as all the TBOs that were fundamental to this whole series happening in the first place. And thank you all. All right, many blessings and feel free. I'm seeing folks talking about more focus groups. Yes, and a lot more listening sessions next time. Focus on job creation and training, I think touches on the workforce development piece. Yes.
Great.
Cool. Progress reports on legislation.
Yeah, I was gonna say, look out for the recordings and the materials that we'll be sending. And remember, you can go to our YouTube channel to see the sessions that you've missed, and feel free to share them with other community groups.
Exactly. Awesome. And then I'm seeing más información y ayuda para la comunidad, more information and help for the community. I think that ties in to helping communities understand budget processes, plus also focusing on coordinating with schools. So definitely seems like a lot of synergy there, more possible in-person forums or ways that we're expanding access as well, maybe through the hybrid process. Enhance infrastructure finance districts created to bring community engagement and accountability for fund spending. Awesome. Thank you all. Have a beautiful night. Feel free to keep on posting. And I think we'll be just kind of wrapping up. And CMO, CMO is the Climate Emergency Mobilization Office who are hosting this event. Thank you. Okay.